Fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop our screen share intro slide and hand it over to John.
Roberta, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let me give you just a moment here to welcome everybody. On behalf of Reading with Pictures, this is our first time running this Teaching with Comics virtual conference. And a lot of work has gone into all of this. A quick shout out, by the way, thank you to all of our board members. Also, a tip of the hat to Josh Elder, who long ago, he's the founder of Reading with Pictures, had a vision of how we could bring comics into the world of teaching. And today we are now well beyond the walls of the schoolroom. And the concept of using comics, graphic novels, manga, animation, and gaming has grown globally. Reading with Pictures continues to expand into visual arts, speech pathology, STEAM, librarianship, research, and a lot more. And of course, this is a big part of this. We've got a lot to cover over the next 3 days. Today's keynote is Dr. Lee Francis. Tomorrow we have Kara Bean joining us, who is a teacher, author, artist, art educator extraordinaire. And putting something together like this, this virtual conference has taken a lot. It happened really, it felt like yesterday we started, but there's so much effort that goes into this. And of course, I want to thank the following people who put so much time into this and energy. Karen Evan and Kate Pearl, who are the puppet masters behind the show today, the wizards who are running all the tech for us. Thank you so much for everything you've done. Jana Tropper, Tracy Edmonds for putting all the programming together, and of course, additional huge thanks to Christina Taylor, Yaika Sabat, Betsy Gomez for all the web support, social media efforts. Without this team, without this family that we have, this stuff just doesn't happen. Also, big thank you to our sponsors, Manga Classics, Pixton, and Diamond Books distributors. Manga Classics is the first mainstream publisher to use authentic manga style adaptation, using Japanese comics for adaptation. And if you haven't been there yet, go to mangaclassics.com. They've got the modernized Shakespeare and Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet coming out this fall. Pixton is a web-based learning tool that allows students and educators to create comics. Pixton is a student-friendly as it allows them to take charge of their learning as they process and create their knowledge in ways that make sense to them. And of course, Diamond Book Distributors, one of the big parts of the foundation of the growth of the use of comics in libraries and schools. Without these sponsors, again, thank you so much for your help. Now I get to introduce a wonderful friend of mine and a board member with Reading with Pictures, Dr. Lee Francis. I get to talk about you first before you get to talk. Lee is the founder of Native Realities, Red Planet Books and Comics, and the Indigenous Comic-Con, as also the current executive director of WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. He's an award-winning performance artist, has been featured in numerous publications throughout his career. His most recent comic book, Ghost River, The Fall and Rise of Conestoga, has received numerous accolades and has been seen previews throughout the country. His family just recently moved they're originally from the Pueblo of Laguna, and out of New Mexico onto the East Coast. Dr. Lee Francis, where have you guys relocated to? And welcome.
Thank you. Gawatsi Hapa, Tawashawashrap, Wahendume Lee Francis, Washeshka Wakame, Medicaname. It's great to be here, Dr. Lee Francis. My family's from the Pueblo of Laguna on my dad's side, and the great state of Missouri on my mom's side.
One more thing, a little bit of housekeeping before I cut you loose, Lee. Sure. There's going to be a survey that pops up for folks. If you wouldn't mind, it's a real quick click through. Hit that for us, and then we'll let you know the results once we're through this program. All right, so
yes, here it goes. I'm launching. This gives us a little bit of an idea who's here with us today. So choose your primary focus as best you are able.
Okay, let's see.
Thank you, voice of God.
I will choose. I'll choose them all. I like all of them. I'll choose
all
each of them.
Yes.
All of them. Is there an all of the above?
We thought about having multiple options, but we made people choose just one.
Oh, well.
All right. It looks like most people have had a chance to answer. A few more seconds if you haven't clicked one yet, and I'll show the results. That's kind of an interesting group. Okay, yeah. Poll is ending. And here's who's with us today.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Nice.
very balanced.
Very
Brilliant.
cool.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Francis, for letting us get a feel for who's here with us today. And I will hand it back to you.
And one more
Absolutely.
reminder, there is closed captioning available. If you, who was putting that out? Was that Jana? There's closed captioning available on one of the tabs through, oh yeah, CC live transcript at the bottom of your screen. So you should be able to see that. All righty. Dr. Francis, you have the stage.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you again. And a huge shout out to Reading with Pictures. I do have the pleasure and the honor to serve on the board of directors, even through my relocation, which has been great. We have moved east to be closer to family. We're in North Carolina at this point. So I would love to be able to do a quick cyberspace land acknowledgement for Indigenous peoples. The land that I am on right now is Catawba and Lumbee. Those are the peoples, Indigenous peoples that were here as the guardians and stewards of that particular land. Obviously, in your own areas here in the cyber world, I hope that you seek out some of those original custodians, and also to remember that Native and Indigenous people are still here, that they are all around, and that we hold to our communities and our traditions and our values and beliefs in each and every day. So with that, I will get started. I do have a PowerPoint for this. I am thrilled to be able to jump onto this wonderful event. Let me move all of my bits and pieces around over here. So there we go. And I know how fast this came together, and I really I am super indebted and super honored to be a part of this, because I know how difficult it is even to run something like this in digital space. My background really comes from education, so I began working as an educator back almost 20 years ago at this point at Laguna Acoma High School. I taught middle and high school. I've also taught the younger ones, and I've also taught the older ones at this point. So I've moved across the P20 system, mostly working with Native students. And that was really where it got started in terms of how we would connect up learning with comics. I consider myself an Indigennerd from way back. I love comics. I love graphic novels. I grew up very much with most of this stuff from my father. My father was a huge science fiction fan. He was, very much an avid reader and was very supportive of reading. So in some ways, I hear all these stories from folks about how, comics were kind of frowned upon, and high literature and all the rest. And my dad was always just really glad that I was reading, that I was always just, there and enjoying, enjoying anything that would be inspirational. And I think he really thought that was the key to, to positive learning and to solid scholarship later on down the line. So as an Indigennerd going through, I continued that. I role-playing games and tabletop RPGs and gaming and video games and all the rest. And about 2003, began teaching, and recognized something very key and critical was that there wasn't a lot of representational comics for my students at the time that looked like them. And this began the wheels spinning. This was something that started to move both my intellect and my understanding, as well as my teaching vein. What are we missing? What do my students need that is going to be supportive of them in their learning? And at the time when I would look on the shelves, what I would see would be a lot of picture books, and I would see a lot of adult books. So you're thinking like Louise Erdrich, or you're just thinking of like picture stories. And there wasn't a lot in between. And I know how important comic books and popular media was for me. And so I set out to remedy that and right that wrong. And so in 2014, I founded Native Realities Press, which is our publishing house. We're the largest publisher in the continental United States of Native-centric, Native-specific, by, for, and about Native and Indigenous people comic books. 2016, we went on and decided we wanted to throw a party around that instead, and launched the Indigenous Comic-Con. And we hosted that up until, right before the pandemic. We were one of the groups that got shut down in early 2020. And then shortly after that, in 2016, 2017, we opened Red Planet Books and Comics, which is the only Native comic shop in the world. We were shortlisted. We were on the. We didn't make it to the final round, but we were nominated for an Eisner Award for Comic Book Shop. And all of this work really talks about representation and the work that I've done. Now, before I continue, I must say that in this talk and in this keynote, I am not going to be proclaiming in any way that I am the representative for any other group other than the one that I've worked closest with as Native folks, right? So speaking for African American or Asian American or Latino, Latinx, Latina, I can give sort of overviews in terms of the industry, and I can talk about why representation is important. But I will be centering this around the Indigenous experience to the best of my ability, and to the practice, the work that I have done within this space, because I think that's very important that it's centered and that creating the space for the right voices to be able to speak about their own experiences in this. So I will talk broadly, speak broadly about Native representation, as well as kind of addressing the need for dynamic representation overall and what that means. So the title of this is There's Always Room for More Stories. And it's the fight for dynamic representation in pop culture. Now, for pop culture, I'll be talking mostly about comic books, but we can extend this out to nerd culture, thinking about games, tabletop games, any of the analog approaches, science fiction and fantasy, etc. But wanting to really focus within the comic book realm simply because it's where superheroes exist. And so this fight that we see that goes on within these spaces is a fight that often pits sort of what we think of mainstream versus marginalized. And it's something that I have been has been very noticeable for me throughout my career, is where do the voices of Native people get to come in? Because if you look at this was 2018, so this was 3 years ago, the numbers are getting better, but this is the representation. Now, this is children's books. And we can kind of see this, we do group comic books sometimes into this, but this is children's books. Children's diversity, or diversity in children's books 2018. American Indians and First Nations is 1% of those books. And we see 1,500 books that are representative of white children. And all the other folks sort of creating this space. So you can see all the pieces here. That's out of 3,000 books that were published in 2018. Now there have been some significant strides. There's been a lot that's come out in the last 2 years. So those numbers are changing, and they're changing rapidly. And I think it's always important to remind folks that as it changes, we have to be aware that the industry itself responds to those changes, but can easily default and regress to the mean. Because the mean is this. For Native people, there is this idea that we are caught in this crosshairs. We are caught in this paradox of between erasure and misrepresentation. Because for 400 years, we have not been able or been in control of our narrative. And that goes for many other marginalized voices not being in control of their own narratives when they would reach the mainstream publications and publishing. And so this idea of erasure as a counterpoint to misrepresentation leaves very little room for the last 400 plus years, for finding authentic and dynamic representations of Native people. Now, this could be for lack of knowledge on part of mainstream, sometimes white editors and writers. This could be much more insidious, which you see a lot in terms of journalistic spaces throughout the turn of the century, in the 1900s and the early 1800s, when we were still considered at war, the Indian Wars. It also could be that it is a malaise, and that it cycles back on itself, and that malaise comes in. I guess it wouldn't be a malaise, it's a comfort. It's a comfort to think about the various phases and pages and the Old West and all of this nostalgia, the nostalgia bubble, on how Native people have been represented. And the identity that has been formed around Native existence and Indigenous existence has been one that has been romanticized time and time again. It begins in the 1600s with the first mention and the first understanding of the character called the noble savage. And you can see the noble savage there in his full beauty and viewpoint, with his bow and his six-pack. The noble savage is the ideal and the epitome of the romanticized notion of America. You also see the savage intent that is also represented within these early plays and broadsides, these woodcuts of Native identity and Indigenous identity. Now, this is very similar to what we see in terms of a lot of other representative images of marginalized peoples within the Americas. But these are the earliest representations. This is the representations of Native peoples who took a very interesting place of honor, because the early settlers and colonial immigrants really were looking to establish relationships, right? Because even as a decimated group, decimated by disease, the group still here held a considerable amount of power. And they were still the overriding force. When you have a group of 300 people versus a group of 10,000 people, the 300 people are going to try and figure out how to stay alive. And so they made government to government relations. And so this idea of the noble savage was imbuing these particular people with this idea of nobility. And if you've seen some of the reasons why in things like Exterminate All the Brutes on Netflix or on HBO, you can see that there were various reasons as to why this came into play. A lot of it having to do with the idea of terra nullius, which is that these groups of people were savages so that we could claim the land, that Europe could claim the land, but also this nobility because they wanted to do it, how should we say, right, especially for the groups of people that were traveling over non-enforced. So as you continue to move forward, you move forward through various ages and these various representations, always and really consistently showing Native people in this state of grace and state of bliss until they become sort of the villain in these spaces, right? And you see these villainous characters and you see these misrepresentations. I think that's Anthony Quinn in the movie on the bottom there. And these representations as film begins to develop. But one of the places where it developed early on and took a foothold was within comic books. And comic representations of Native people and graphic representations started early on with the illustrated classics. And as you see, The Last of the Mohicans, which is one of the earliest books in the 1800s that chronicles this idea of indigenous transference as the natives moving from the noble savage to being the red devil. You see both of those characters exist in Last of the Mohicans. So as you begin to see that, and you begin to see this change and this turn of events, you begin to see how this frames out within all of the popular media that goes on. And the commodification of Native identity, which goes back to the fact that historically during this time, you are seeing the obliteration, you are seeing the ethnocide and genocide of Native peoples being forced off their land. From the 1700s all the way through the late 1800s till the turn of the century, 1900, 1890, you see that Native people are becoming more and more, their identity is becoming more and more commodified as they continue to lose their lives, their identities, their actual identities. And so that crux that I talk about between erasure and misrepresentation begins to come full circle. As a group of people are being erased, their stories are being told by someone else. And now you have to contend with how the identity of Native and Indigenous peoples is being represented outside of themselves in a way that then cycles back to become internalized. And so you see these representations. Of course, we know Peter Pan. What makes the red man red? And the pop culture identification of how this plays out in children's movies and educational tomes. You see the Boston baked beans and the use of the Native folks in that. You see the Apache Kid. Apache Kid, Indian or white man? And these are all these kinds of questions, and they were very subtly discriminatory, and sometimes they were overtly discriminatory. There was a good deal of comic books and references that came out in the early 1900s during the Western eras where a lot of the times you just saw a Native guy getting punched in the face by a cowboy, or by a gunslinger or by somebody on the covers of these comics that came out. So this representation is not dynamic in a way that is positive, in a way that reinforces a cultural identity that is necessary for those outside of the mainstream American white hegemonic. And so as that starts to push out and as those spaces continue to be made, you begin to see a lot of these, ways in which the media thinks through its portrayals, but sometimes still causes what we can say is collateral pop culture damage, right? So you see various representations of Native folks who are not the heroes. These are the Red Devils. And then you get to things like Dances with Wolves, and you see these representative images up here and how Native people are portrayed. Well, it's a little bit better than it was, but it still contained elements that you saw before in all of these other mediums leading into this time. Now, as we think about this, there is a moment to take a pause. And why is this so key and critical? Well, I think it's important when I'll tell a story. So when we opened Red Planet Books and Comics, a lot of people coming in on those original days, and going through. And I remember there was a person that walked in with a friend of hers, and it was almost like a reaction video, right? So her friend, who was Native, had already come into the shop, and this was she's bringing in, another young Native woman, and her friend had already come to the shop, already knew about it, and so it was like, oh, you got to come down here and check out this, this bookstore. So they come on down, it's a comic shop, right? And so there's this moment where a friend comes in, she's just watching her intently, and the other woman who's new kind of starts looking around, and she just goes like this, and she's does this circle. You can see all the things on our shelves, and it's Native comics and posters and everything else like that. If you've ever visited our shop. And there she is, and she turns around, she does like a 360, and she goes, oh, this is awesome. And in that moment, what was so stunningly clear was not the awesomeness because of the novelty of the existence of Red Planet and the shop that we opened, but that in this space, in this 600 square foot space, she saw a full representation, a dynamic representation of herself, who she was and where she came from. And that comes out in all sorts of ways. And my students, would often talk about how they liked the books. They liked things that looked like them. They liked all books. They loved comics because they could see themselves as being any type of superhero. But one that looked like them, one that represented their community, that looked like grandma and grandpa. Those are so few and far between. And I think that holds for most, young people in marginalized groups where they don't have these types of positive representations. What you can see within the African-American community is a lot of the times, especially through the 80s, on television, it was the drug dealers, it was the inner city. And it was these idea of these dog whistle code words. Through cartoons for, Latino characters, you have Speedy Gonzalez and his cousin Slowpoke. And you have these characters that we identify with. And in these groups, many people find and take heart for these characters, these icons. But some of them they weren't positive. And they weren't necessarily intended to be positive. They were intended to be part of mass media stereotyping, easy marks, if you will. And so I think it's necessary when we think about who controls the narrative. Because that narrative is really how we associate our own internals. It's that mirror that Foucault talks about how we form our own identities. And when we're being told the story constantly, any of us, native, non-native, whoever, when we're constantly being told a story about who we are, then that story becomes a part of our own identity. Who we are becomes representative and is emerging of both the popular culture as well as our own internal processes. And so if for 400 years you're being told that you are a noble savage, it becomes a cognitive dissonance or a schema crack, when I don't look like that as a Pueblo male. We don't ride horses out there in Albuquerque. I mean, some of us do, but we're not horse culture people. We're not the fierce warriors of the plains that you see all the time in popular media. We're farmers. We built, the earliest apartment buildings. As my dad liked to say, we are round and brown. And, I've probably fought an ear of corn more than I've fought anybody out in the plains. That's what we did. We were arid desert people. And we stayed on our original land for as long as we possibly could, outside of drought and, but launching the first conquest, right? There's this amazing histories which didn't look like me in the comic books. They didn't look like me or represent me. And so as I'm trying to understand what that means growing up as a young Pueblo male, and I keep seeing this, I start to think about, well, do I need to look like that? Is that the only way that I can engage society, is to be a fierce native warrior? No, obviously, I just stayed being a nerd and just stayed playing Dungeons and Dragons instead, and slowly formulating my own identity. But when someone else controls the narrative and they put that in front of you constantly and consistently, you begin to absorb that, and it starts to become something until you begin to question it. And then you begin to think of how you can engage your own thoughts and spirit, mind, heart, and body in developing a new narrative. And it's important to note that publishing has been around, publishing as we know it, the publishing industry started with Cambridge University Press in London in the 1500s, the mid 1500s. So this institutionalization of who controlled the narrative, especially in print, has been 500 years ongoing, right? And because of this, within this 500-year stretch and this 500-year span of how the media has gone, it has left little room for other voices to emerge, unless they conform to the way that pop culture and mass media has been able to represent them. So even if you have a dynamic idea, say in the 1900s, to write about your life growing up as an Indian boy, like Charles Eastman did, Ohiesa, my Indian boyhood, it still conforms to the ways in which we think of Native people. Charles Eastman was a doctor. He was one of the earliest Native doctors. He was one of the earliest Native autobiographers that had published work, several pieces of published work. And yet the publishing industry does what it does to continue to make that space. Now, the reason why, as I said, I don't speak necessarily outside for other marginalized voices or groups, but it also is important to think about the way in which Native people have been represented, because it is a very compelling case. Because Native people often are varied. We're various colors and frames. I don't have long hair, and I did at one point, but it's like the shoreline. It is slowly going away. It's low tide up here. But I had it. I had the long hair, and in the summertime, I definitely got you can see my watch, Dan, right? So, but there's a whole range and spectrum of identity and colors and front facing, if you will, what we look like in society. Well, how do you associate this cultural identity with a physical identity or physical look if they don't entirely match the grand narrative, the main Western narrative? And I think that that's one thing that Native folks have a little bit of that space in. And Indígena, so we can include, our Latino relations. For African Americans, it's a little bit different, because it is fully there. So what are the representational pieces that come out of that? Well, there's internal conversations, but it is absolutely, controlled in a particular space by who controls the narrative. Now, it's interesting to note that this narrative was controlled all the way up until the mid-1900s. The earliest Black magazine publisher was John Johnson out of Chicago. And that was Jet magazine, I think one of the early ones. Ebony came out in the 40s. This was 1945. And as we know, a lot of magazine publishers were also comic book publishers. They had a lot of overlap. Latino publishing was 1978, 79. And native publishing was not until the mid 80s. One of the earliest ones that I could find was Greenfield Review Press. Now there's several more, but this is a long time coming about creating dynamic, positive representations in popular culture. And the importance for this being how young people that may identify that way or may identify in different ways, and how young people that don't identify in these ways with these voices are able to find and learn and benefit from the multitude of stories. And that's where we make the little bit of the turn. It's the why. It's the why this is important. Well, we know psychologically that when young people see themselves represented in positive and dynamic ways, that makes a big impact on their behavior. It makes a big impact on their self-esteem. There's numerous studies out there for all you educators. I'm not going to belabor it with, I'll just put a big why on there, and then you can question all the existence. But there are numerous studies that point to this and point to how detrimental, derogatory imagery can have a severe and significant negative effect on self-esteem. One of the big studies, multiple studies that has been out there, has been around the issue of mascots and how mascots reflect young people in those spaces, especially when they go into various schools and districts where people are yelling and saying native slurs and yelling about, kill them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we do that with all sports, and everybody says, well, it's time to toughen up. And it's like, but we know psychologically there is long-term damage. We also know that the brilliance and beauty and joy of comic books is that they're supposed to be joyful. They are supposed to allow us to escape. They're supposed to allow us to be able to be that superhero and to be, to take on truth, justice in the American way, to leap tall buildings into single bound, to Hulk out, punch aliens, etc. And that goes only so far, because it's really neat when you get to see yourself as part of that too. I love me some Iron Man. That's what I grew up with. I grew up with really just like the big two, because I was huge into Norse mythology. So I really grew up. I'm a Marvel kid. I'm sorry for all you DC folks out there. I like DC. I've read the stuff. Just saw The Suicide Squad the other night. Choice. No spoilers. I could do some spoilers. No spoilers. But I grew up very much a Marvel kid and Thor, because I loved Norse mythology. So I was totally all into Norse mythology and Thor and the whole thing. Greek mythology, when they bring in the Greek characters, that was awesome too. And Iron Man, because I was a huge tech kid. My dad was a sci-fi nerd, and I loved all the stuff about that. But it wasn't until the first times when I saw native characters that it really, there was a jolt. It was something completely different. The earliest one that I remember seeing when I was young was Sonny Landham playing Billy Soul in Predator. And sometimes when I've gone and spoken at folks, all I have to do is like, best representation, and I'll do this thing right here. And the native folks remember that, because we all sort of got up and cheered, because it was the first time we saw a native guy in the mainstream films. But what was really unique was that he wasn't being native. It wasn't long hair. It wasn't, spiritual practices and all the rest. If you watch the movie again, Billy talks very much like using traditional understandings, like, yeah, the predators were already here before, and I know of these things. We talked about them. They're going to kill us all. We're all going to die. And Billy slowly loses his mind over the course of the movie, but he also is the last one standing next to the hero. So he understands how to do this, right? And one thing that I loved about Predator was the fact that it was a really diverse, multicultural group of folks that all went in and all got slaughtered, but they did it together. And they weren't portraying stereotypes or misrepresentations of themselves. The second time I remember was of seeing Native folks and getting that same sort of jolt, I guess for a different reason, was the cheesecake era, and seeing J. Scott Campbell's Gen 13, and they had the Native character Sarah Rainmaker in there, and she was Apache, and she was also a lesbian. Oh my gosh! And I'm 13 years old, so not only is she just like, and you all, it is the age of the puffery, right? So it's all around. Oh man, for a 13-year-old kid. But what sparked even more was that she was Native, and there was somebody, and she was badass, and she could like lightning, and she was storm powers and all the rest of that. And that was really influential. And I talk about that a lot because it's one of the moments when I can very distinctly remember feeling that engagement and that representation of not something where I was like, the last story that I very much remember was that when I went to go see Wonder Woman, and Eugene Braverock, who plays the Chief in Wonder Woman, the first one, right, is a big fan, a big supporter of Indigenous Comic-Con. He's a wonderful guest and a wonderful human being. So I was really excited because I think it came out the same year that we were going to get to meet him, and he was coming on out. But I went to go see the movie. And interestingly enough, as a side story, I was sitting right next to the current Secretary of the Interior, Deborah Haaland, who's a good friend. She's from Albuquerque, and she's from Laguna, where I'm from. So we're watching the movie, and I'm just like, oh, this is awesome. And then he has that moment where he turns, and they're just like, she asks him, she's like, what happened to your people? And he's like, his people, points to Chris Pine. And I was like, oh, I was so excited about that. And I remember a visceral response of this sort of reclaiming of this narrative. In a way, it wasn't just like, oh, well, we had some stuff, some trouble. I mean, he just called him on it. But all throughout the movie, I'm thinking, not going to make it. They're all going to get sacrificed. This is going to be terrible. And it gets to the end of the movie, and the whole cadre of sidekicks, including the Chief, including Jean Braverock, they live. And this was so exciting for me because that was the first thing I turned to. Secretary Haaland at the time, she was working, and she wasn't secretary then, but she turns to me, she says, what do you think? I was like, Native guy lived to the end. And she just kind of looked at me, and she was like, really? Like, that's what you and I was just like, they don't make it. We never make it to the end of the movie. This was awesome. So I was very excited about that. And I think that happens for a lot of us when we have not had the opportunity to be a part of that narrative. When we see characters that are represented and become representational of the superheroes that we aspire to be. It's Captain Marvel. It's Wakanda Forever. It's Wonder Woman. It's the new Shang-Chi. When we see this on a grand scale, but even when we're reading the smallest graphic novel, you're reading American-Born Chinese, or you're reading, the Latinx comic explosion. When you're reading, America, La Borinqueña, when you see these representations as superheroes, it makes a huge impact, longer than we can possibly imagine, because these are the moments that stay with us, and we tell stories about them, and we pass on more of those stories. Because when we allow for that space and we search deliberately for that space, there's so many stories to be able to tell. I've always wanted to see myself in a suit of mech armor, something that I've always wanted to do. And I get to do that. When I tell that story, I get to be a part of this. That story for me is something that is, becomes dynamic. And because it goes beyond simply telling a story of just a guy in a mech suit, but I get to add the things that make me unique and make my culture unique. I get to talk about, how Pueblo people, fought the first revolution. It doesn't have to be the main part of it, or it could be, but there's space and there's room for that. And that's what we've been really looking at within marginalized voices and communities. When we talk about diversity and we talk about this space, it's not saying that we want to, eliminate things, but it's saying that there is a fluidity, that we can bring in our own representations, that we can find this room, because this is not a zero-sum game. And I think is what often gets confused today in this hyper-intense world that we live in. I think a lot of people, when we see, or I think there are a number of people, not a lot, but there is a very vocal majority that when we see characters like, when they see characters like this, they feel that it's something that is going to take away from their experience. And that's as far from the truth as possible, because I would have said that 50 years ago, because printing was very, very difficult. And access to the media in the marketplace was even more difficult. If you could get something done, it was promoted and marketed as a native thing, or the African American thing, or the Asian thing. And right now you're seeing such a blur of boundaries of where people are writing across. You have indigenous futurisms, which is moving into science fiction, and there's elements of magical realism, which are popping the top chart of fiction. And then you have nonfiction stuff that's using graphic medium to tell all these stories. And I think that's what it comes down to, is that there is a misconception that if I get the chance to tell my story, then it's going to eliminate someone else's story, when there's room for all the stories. And there's the title. There's always room for more stories. Stories are not a finite resource. We tell stories every single day. I've told about a dozen of them in the last hour to you right now. So there's stories everywhere. Now, these stories can be frivolous, and they can be serious, and they can have meaning, but they're endless. For the 7 billion people on this planet, that means there's 7 billion stories going on constantly, one narrative at a time, one story at a time, for one instance that's going on. Now, we can reflect and say that some stories may be better than others. Some stories have a different narrative than others. Some stories are weird and I can't understand them, but a lot of that's a personal choice. I can also reflect on and say, that's not my favorite story, but it's well written, or that's not my favorite story, but I really appreciate where it was going, right? But that becomes an aesthetic rather than room for these kinds of stories. And so as we build this stuff out, we can see that we don't have to put this stuff in place, but we have to recognize that there are still a lot of folks that tend to believe in these spaces for a couple of reasons. And it also falls on us too, right? So all of us as humans run into the first part, which is that scarcity mentality, which is that there's not going to be enough room. Now, this comes from really because a lot of this is commercialized. A lot of this stuff is comic books, publishing, big pop culture media, mass market media, and mass media are all dependent upon an economy, an economic, and commerce, right? So they all require a person, okay, who wants to buy your thing. So it gets really crowded. And so you're kind of thinking about that, right? So I can tell my story, but there's not going to be a lot of space in the shelf, on the shelves or in that shop when I want to go tell my story. Because what am I competing against? Well, it's going to be that scarcity mentality. I'm competing against Iron Man. I'm competing against Spider-Man. I'm competing against the Suicide Squad, right? So if I'm competing against that and I keep this idea, then we run into a scarcity mentality, which is there's only enough room for 4 or 5, and you have to dominate the market in order to get your stories and your voices out there. There could be some reckoning with that, right? So there could be some understanding that there is a limited amount of shelf space. But there's not a limited amount, there's an unlimited amount of story space. How you position that, who you work with, who you get those stories out to is not dependent upon a shelf. In fact, we know with the digital world, there are no shelves. The shelves are infinite just as well to match the infinity of all the stories that we can tell. And so the scarcity mentality is something that holds over from a consumerist society that says that there's only enough room in the shop, and then I'm only going to buy these books because of if somebody actually is interested in them. And that still holds for the publishers, that there is a scarcity mentality of the work that is coming out of publishing, right? And what they're capitalizing on. And so if I make room for one native, that's it. I don't have room for anybody else in this space. If I make room for 10 African American and Black folks, that's it. I got no more room for anybody else. And so it continues to be reinforced with the scarcity mentality. As I said, I dispelled that notion in some ways, Because yes, there are shelf restrictions. Yes, there are shelf limitations. I can't carry every comic that I want to at my shop. I have 800 square feet. It's not a lot of room. But there's a lot of room on the internet. And there's a lot of room for people that are looking for this type of stuff. Because the more that it comes out, the more it gives us the opportunity to be able to tell this. So there's a lot of room for these stories to continue to develop. They create dynamic, positive representations. And that dynamic is what I'll come back to here in just a moment, because it's that dynamic part that I think I've identified to be able to showcase what you can look for. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. One of the other reasons that you get a little bit of a pushback, and possibly even internally, when you start to think about how we change out the canon and make room for more stories, because it doesn't mean they got to go away, it just means that they're taking a little sabbatical. Other things get to come in. Is that you get this sort of space where you get this overlap of grand mythologies with personal mythologies and core identity markers. So one of the prime examples of this would be the myth of Thanksgiving. So when I talk and teach about the myth of Thanksgiving, a lot of times people don't want to deal with that, because it creates this tension of saying, well, but I love Thanksgiving, and if I get rid of all the Thanksgiving stuff, then I don't get to have turkey anymore, and I don't get to go watch football, and everybody's just trying to get rid of all the things that I like. I love Thanksgiving. I used to celebrate it with my dad, and my dad really loved Thanksgiving until his passing. It was a family gathering. It was wonderful. I've celebrated it less because my wife is a vegetarian, so turkeys are not high on our list for eating, and so we just kind of we go spend time with friends, we go enjoy ourselves, but we don't put this focus on the grand mythology of Thanksgiving. And when we combine this grand mythology, because as we've been educated and taught about Thanksgiving, that it was the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, before they didn't even have a name, they were just the Indians. Remember, it was the Pilgrims and the Indians, for those of you that were taught anywhere prior to the 90s, maybe even the 2000s. But now they finally have a name of who they were. And because of a lot of this work of telling these stories, it's now coming out that this history is changing. It wasn't necessarily this great thing where the natives invited, the pilgrims in, and the pilgrims took their place before God, and proclaimed this land while the Indians kind of sat huddled in the corner, and lots of memes make fun of this, all the rest. But these grand mythologies, when they couple with personal mythologies, then begin to create core identity markers. And this identity marker reinforces through the scarcity mentality. So these identity markers are the hardest thing to be able to work through and come by. It's the idea that when it says, hey, I associate with this, and if you're making room for a new story, then that means this is going to be dispelled. We can think about that with slavery. We can think about that with the Bracero program and immigration and any of these very difficult topics. And one of the reasons why I like comics the most is because there is a lot of room for that too, in a way that is accessible to a mass market audience. One of my friends just put out a great graphic novel, The Day the Klan Came to Town. Tells the story of one of the earliest Black revolutions. And it's really important work, and it's told through the medium of comics and pictures. Because I think of all the publishing spaces, it has been the one that has been both controlled and open simultaneously. And I think it has to do with the reading with pictures. It has to do with the way that you can change the narrative very simply through one image. If you put a superhero, you put a Puerto Rican superhero up on the page, there's a visceral reaction. And so those identity markers can change, and they can develop, and they can evolve. And you begin to look at these grand mythologies, and you can separate them out from the personal mythologies, especially when you combine them with images, and especially when you combine them with a compelling narrative and an open mind that says, hey, there's room for everybody's narrative. And there's room for individuals to be able to tell their own stories once again, as they never have been able to before. So as I started with this, there was a reason why, because I love an image of stars. And I think it goes back to our that we are made up of stars. And Native and Indigenous folks have star stories. We've been telling stories of space travelers since time immemorial. They go way back into our oral record, as for all of us. And I think it's very important because it's something that connects all of us together. As there room for billions upon billions of stars, there's room for just as many stories. Each one of those stars overhead connects us into this stratosphere, but these stories connect us to each other. And they allow us to be able to be our full selves, our human selves with one another, and allow us to learn and engage with each other. And they allow us to continue to find joy in all of these spaces. And as we go and we find more comics and deliberately look to make room for those spaces, we turn to educators, we turn to young people to guide that way. And so as we continue to think about the night sky, and we continue to think about how do we build a stronger society, a more joyous society, a beautiful society, a kind society, we only need to look towards the sky because there's stories everywhere. Thank you very much. I'll say Toa e at this point for this because there'll be a little bit of transition time, and but that's my speech, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Dr. Lee Francis. We actually have a little bit of follow-up, some Q&A for you.
Oh, great.
Several easy ones and then a bit of a longer one.
Okay.
Easy, softball number one. Does your shop ship? I'm far away, but we have a large native population.
Yes, we definitely ship. That's one thing that we have been really keen about, is trying to open up distribution. One of the reasons I actually am here on the East Coast now is so that we can have a couple of distribution points throughout the United States. So we're all about shipping. We're all about trying to find really cool comic stuff you probably won't find anywhere else too. So you can take a look over with us because we got some really neat stuff. We got neat stuff across the board, not just native too, because we source out from a lot of friends that, you know, you may only have, if you aren't looking, find something on Kickstarter, but we got lots of friends and we like to showcase their stuff as well.
Alrighty, next up, how do you discuss issues of representation in comics and media with young children like elementary age? And if there are any good comics for this conversation?
Yikes. You know, there's a line blur right there, because as we think, you know, it's really interesting because we scaffold kids in this way that we're like, hey, read these great picture books, read these wonderful things with these illustrations. And then by the time they like hit middle and high school, we're like, now stop, now just read words. That's what it's like a sucker game, right? Like it always made me mad because I was just like, why? Let's go back to just reading with pictures. So there's some really great, I think it's really content oriented. Some of the artists that are doing work, I would say at Mountain's base is Wishoyo Alvitre, who's a comic book artist who I've worked with. She illustrated Ghost River. She did Echo in the latest Marvel Voices, the Indigenous Voices that just came out. So you can check out like that kind of work. I think it's when we're talking about, I would say, talking about the grand stuff and the big stuff can often go over their head. I think as a teacher working with the little ones, you can serve as a guide and give them like one story to focus on, and words with pictures. And I know we don't do picture books, we're comic folks, but that early scaffolding for these kiddos, they're very similar. Mostly if I was talking with comic book or picture book creators yesterday and the day before for a weekend thing, and I was like, man, we do the same thing. Like we just put it into smaller boxes on one page. You all just use like one big page and the text on there, right? So I think there's some really great ones that can address these issues, but I think you're looking for single unique stories, and you provide the guidance in some ways to say, like, here's how you can deal. Like, you're not going to throw the Tulsa Race Massacre or the Day the Klan Came to Town on an elementary kid. There are some elementary kids that could run with it, but you're probably going to want to run with things that are going to be a little bit, more. El Defo is one off the top of my head that I think has just been fantastic. My kid read that 2 years ago in later elementary school. I think it could go a little bit earlier, but you need some help with it. Talking about marginalized communities, right? So.
All right, so somebody doing some research. Dr. Francis, I'm doing research right now With Winsor McCay's early 20th century Little Nemo and Slumberland comics, one
Ooh.
might expect we must grapple with caricature, negative representations of marginalized peoples. How can you speak to whether or not you see a place for these comics in the classroom and how we should handle caricature within them? In other words, can we bring these into the high school classrooms and use them? Use these representations to teach lessons that could be valuable today.
Yes, but not on their own, right? They have to be paired with something that can be used as a comparison. I think one of the issues that a lot of us have had when we're dealing with this type of representation is that the pushback is always that, like, well, if you get rid of this, you're getting rid of history. And I don't say that. I run a bookstore, right? I'm like, I'm not into censoring my, like I was like, what's good for the goose can easily be good for the gander. If I start censoring, then everybody, and I also say that there is a line, there are certain limits that I won't cross, right? I don't want to say that I'm just like, yeah, we'll carry everything. I'm a native shop. I'm not going to carry everything anyway.
Right.
But I also think that you need to couple something like that with something where the representation is by the community, by the actual voices, so that you can see. Because if you were to throw that out and you had, a kid that's mixed, or a kid that, is reflective in that misrepresentative way, or that stereotypical way, they're going to take that in a way and internalize that. They may not tell you, right? But it's there. They're going to see that. They're going to do that. But if you can say, like, hey, listen, let's start with this and let's read this, and we're going to read them simultaneously. What do you think between the two? That starts to open that up. And it takes a little more work because you got to do 2 books, but I think it's well worth it. And then as the new stuff comes in, it can actually start to, I think comic history is really important, but I also think we fetishize that in many ways, right? It's John and I have talked for years about, man, Watchmen pops up into the thing, and it's just like everyone's like, well, let's order Watchmen for the class because it's on the great novels list, the great graphic. And it's like, if you don't have an understanding of comics, and a lot of kids don't, so much of that book is going to be lost. And it's not a good teaching tool. Like, it really isn't, because there is so much nuance. It was satire. It was a pushback against the industry. It was supposed to be, this whole thing. That's a whole different keynote. But anyway, you want to be able to teach them simultaneously in parallel with each other.
Right. Okay. Any recent titles or creators you'd recommend that you feel are doing a great job in the field of representation?
Rosarium Publishing is absolutely stellar in terms of what they're doing. You can look at, what's his name? Dr. Luis Aldama, who's now down at the University of Texas. He's running the Latino Comics Institute, I believe is what it is, Latinx Comics Institute down there. So you can, and he's got 3 or 4 really good study books. Michael Shayasi, who's Caddo, native Caddo, he's got a book out called Native Americans in Comic Books, or American Indians in Native Americans in Comic Books. It tells the whole history of representation of Native peoples from the earliest, not by their own, right? So,
Right.
But, I think there's a couple. I will say that I'm a little sparse in terms of like Asian American, Pacific Islander representation. Not just, my knowledge is not as good as it should be, so I will just admit that fully. I know there's some really cool anthologies. Jin Yang is always a solid seller. American Born Chinese is on my canon list, and really spoke to me about representation, right? Like, because of how he had to deal with, his tradition and what, pop culture wanted him to look like, and what Americana and California wanted him to look like, and the world wanted him to look like, right? So, those are my just quick recommendations.
Alrighty. And one last one. As a creator, I've had clients request diversity swap, where some characters are replaced with other races, so there is as much representation as can fit. And typically African American, Asian American, recently LGBTQ. Now I'm making an effort to discuss these options before the work is completed, as opposed to revising existing works. But what is the best way to discuss this phenomenon with clients? And I get the sense the clients are trying to accommodate diversity ahead of embracing it. And I want to be able to encourage the latter if possible. How do I handle that?
That's tough. And I will say that the toughest part is, you have to get the feel in your own industry. I definitely think I have a lot more privilege to be able to say, like, nope, we're not doing that today, kind of thing. I think partly it's to showcase one, because if you're working with clients, then you're working in an industry. So you want to showcase, one of the things you can showcase is money. Obviously, that's always going to move folks, right? So you can tell them like, hey, you know what? Rosarium does this amount and they've got brand new characters. This thing just popped up with brand new characters. It's not just changing over or doing, that's always been our big thing. It's just like, man, okay, I dig it. And I dig that we're trying to do some cool things, but also make new characters, right? Embrace new characters, embrace, there's so many stories. And I think that that's also a thing that you can say is like, hey, the Lee Francis fella and, other people that I've talked to and engaged with in these social circles are looking for like something new that they can gravitate towards. Gen 13 was brand new. Sarah Rainmaker was brand new. As problematic as it is, right? As problematic as it was, it's still a new character, right?
I think one of the things I've been in those conversations, and one of the first questions I ask is, what do you know about these people that you want to bring in? Are you just playing lip service? Or are you actually investing in the story?
Right. And are you investing in the community, right? Like, are you investing in me as a native writer or my friends as Asia? Like, are you going to is this going to be something, or is this just cover show?
Right. All right, my friend, thank you so much for this. One more time, for people who want to get orders from you and ship direct, what is the name of your website, sir?
www.redplanetbooksandcomics.com. Books, letter N, comics.com. redplanetbooksandcomics.com. You can find us online. Find me online, Instagram at Pueblo Jones. You can find me on Twitter at Lee Francis IV. You can check it out. I promote a bunch of stuff. And of course, we're all over Facebook. Check out our pages. We got a lot of great things coming down the pipe. If you want to learn more about Native pop culture, we actually just partnered with A Tribe Called Geek, which is a tech and pop culture website. And that's A Tribe Called Geek.org, I think, or .com, tribecalledgeek.com. So you can check out all the cool things. We're just getting ready to revamp and relaunch with some really cool content coming up. So in the meantime, I'll say, John, and to everybody, Dawa'e, thanks for taking the time to listen to me. It's always fun to, throw out there what I can, and hope I hope you pick up a little bit of something, whatever you need.
It's a pleasure to call you a friend, my friend.
You too.